Hello, this is Professor Krantz at the Canadian Institute for Jewish Research. We are doing today the 11th in the series of Israelite programs on key issues in the news pertaining to Israel and the Middle East. Today we're going to look at an aspect of the two recent terrorist episodes, one in the US in Boston and the other here in Canada. These two came together, and what I want to talk about today is much of the commentary on the two episodes. In Boston, two young Chechens who were resident in America, both citizens, I believe, exploded bombs at the end of the Boston Marathon, killing 3 people and wounding over 200, seriously wounding. And a fourth murder occurred as the two fled the scene and encountered a policeman at MIT, whom they shot. One was killed in a gunfight, and another was finally captured in Watertown, Massachusetts, the younger of the two. Here in Canada, two Muslims, one from Tunisia by origin, the other of Palestinian origin, were apprehended in the course of planning to explode a via rail train from the States coming into Canada and to derail it and cause mayhem and murder. So these two things happened in relative juxtaposition. And what is most interesting, has been the media coverage of the two events, because much of this coverage is peculiar in that it talks about the two events, and it may even talk about terrorism, but it doesn't use the term Muslim or the term Islam. A very case in point was an article published a day later or so here in Canada on the Canadian episode, which talked about violence, terrorism, crime, and not once in a very long article, this by a person called a specialist in terrorism, not once was the obvious fact that both of the apprehended alleged murderers in Canada were Muslims, and very consciously so, very extremely so. And that raises a question that has marked a good deal of the coverage of Islamist, or Islamic, if you will, terrorism, both in Europe and in the United States and Canada. The reluctance to, in fact, identify the most salient aspect of the terrorists' episodes and of the terrorists themselves, which is the fact that they are Muslim and usually extremist Muslim. Why is that? Why is that the case? How can you possibly describe this terrible reality without factoring into it one of its key elements? So some observers ascribe it to political correctness, a kind of squeamishness about calling a spade for fear of casting aspersions upon a religious or an ethnic minority. Other observers talk about this as shrewd realpolitik, say on the part of President Obama and his advisors in the States, who also tend not to use the term Muslim or Islam, or even sometimes terrorist. Why realpolitik? Because it is a way of trying to limit the consequences of the act, and not to, by calling it what it is, engender a broader reaction among Muslims both worldwide and in the U.S. So if you don't identify the killers as Muslims or Islamists or whatever, then you don't risk engendering resentment and opposition. Now, not all observers, of course, engage in this kind of political correctness or realpolitik. There's a good deal of coverage calling a spade and recognizing the Islamist dimension, Muslim dimension. And I hasten to add that, of course, most would seem, as far as we know, in the U.S. and Canada, most Muslim citizens decry this and oppose it. Indeed, in the case of the Toronto attempted terrorism, the whistle was blown by an imam in one of the mosques that one of the two accused figures attended. Nevertheless, it's very clear that there is some connection between Islamism or extreme Muslim affirmation and a tendency towards violence and terrorism. And it would seem that far from being dangerous to note this, and far from implying that every Muslim is therefore guilty, it would seem that it's important to note this in order to deal with it. And that's the key issue that I'd like to conclude on. If you don't recognize reality for what reality is, and the reality is dangerous, negative, threatening, then you run the risk of not being able to deal with that reality. So you have to be truthful to the extent possible about events without jumping to conclusions, without being hysterical, but calling, as I put it, calling a spade a spade. Otherwise, you will obfuscate the reality, and the reality will continue, and it will reach out and hurt you even more than was the case. There are Muslim organizations which immediately jump into the picture and say you can't identify this as Muslim, it's just individuals. If you call it Muslim terrorist, then you are engaging in racism, etc., etc. One of these outfits in the US and in Canada is CAIR, C-A-I-R, which is itself an extremist organization which has been investigated and is an unindicted conspirator in one terrorist case in the US. And they again and again, the minute that anybody, any writer, any media identifies the Muslim or Islamist dimension of a terrorist act, they scream Islamophobia, Islamophobia, racism, prejudice. And that smokescreen has to be dispelled. We have to be rational and observant and identify things for what they are. May not always be right, but in many cases we will be right, and we won't run the risk of engendering even more such events by ignoring their actual content and causes. So thank you very much for tuning in, and we look forward to seeing you again next week at CIJR, Canadian Institute for Jewish Research. Shalom.